Hello, beloveds, and welcome to Christian Emotional Recovery, a podcast for those who are survivors of childhood trauma, emotional neglect, and narcissistic abuse. This podcast is hosted by Rachel Leroy, a college professor and trauma survivor. Many of us spend years trying to heal and don't get anywhere. We don't always target the trauma itself, which is so often what keeps us stuck. This podcast is where faith meets science. Rachel is an emotional healing expert with 20 years of experience applying healing modalities that helped her start making progress after nothing else worked. She'll show you how to do the same. Each week, we'll cover a topic that will show you how to heal trauma for good. Please check out our website and show notes at christianemotionalrecovery.com and join the Facebook community, Trauma Survivors Unite, Christian Emotional Recovery.
Hello, beloveds, and welcome to podcast number 16 in Christian Emotional Recovery, No Mo FOMO. And it's a catchy title, but it means no more fear of missing out. And FOMO is fear of missing out, and I thought this was an important episode because a lot of people that suffer from trauma and that suffer from anxiety and depression often have this fear that something is missing and that they're missing out on something. And I wanted to address that in the podcast today. All right, so fear of missing out, according to Wikipedia, they actually have an informative article that gives you a little background on FOMO, what it is, what are the psychological roots and correlations of it, what's its history, how does it connect to popular culture, and other references that might help shed some light on the topic. But Wikipedia says that FOMO, fear of missing out, is described as a pervasive apprehension that others might be having rewarding experiences from which one is absent. I would expand it also, and this is just my definition, but I would expand it also into fear of missing out of anything or knowing anything or being involved in anything, whether other people are involved in it or not. And so that's how I would expand the definition to make it a little broader. But it says the social anxiety, it's characterized by a desire to stay continually connected with what others are doing, staying involved in everything, knowing about everything. And Joyce Meyer has some great teaching on this too. I don't know that she talks about FOMO exactly, but she does talk about staying in your lane, so to speak, and minding your own business and not needing to know everything. And the Bible preaches against gossip and against getting into everybody's business. And so you could actually argue that some forms of FOMO are actually a sin. And I would agree with that. But I do think that some of it is also rooted in trauma, and that's what we're going to talk about today. It's also defined as fear of regret, which may lead to compulsive concern that one might miss an opportunity for social interaction, a novel experience, a profitable investment, or other satisfying events. In other words, FOMO perpetuates the fear of having made the wrong decision on how to spend time, since one can imagine how things could be different. Does that sound like something that you've experienced a lot in your life? Because I know I have, to the point that my brain has this feedback loop over and over and over, and it just beats on me and torments me at times. You could have done this better. You could have done this. Look at these years of your life you wasted. So-and-so went on this trip and you had a chance to go with them and you didn't go. You could have done so much better there. You know, it's heinous how our minds can just beat us up, especially if we were if we were in an unsupportive environment where we weren't validated, where we weren't seen. Especially if we saw other kids getting things we didn't have, even if it was love. And especially if we did without a lot of things, including the things that make us whole inside. That is going to create something inside of us that always feels like it's missing. And so this fear of missing out, there's a lot more to it, and it could be the subject of 20 books, I think. But I'm just going to stick to some of the, where does it come from? How does it impact trauma survivors and those who have anxiety, depression, and similar conditions? And I'll tell you a little bit about my experience with FOMO because I think a story will help you to see common experiences in your own life that you can identify so you can start working on figuring out ways to heal that and to deal with it. FOMO, I believe, is something we can't always completely get rid of, but we can definitely manage it and manage it a lot better. And I'm going to talk about how God can use FOMO to get us to take action and make right choices, because FOMO isn't, you can't just say it's all bad and that it's negative and nothing good ever comes out of it. It's a matter of knowing how to cope with it, how to manage it, how to understand it, and in some cases, even how to use it. And in other cases, how to get rid of it, which means no Mo FOMO. So, and some people could take those 4 letters and swap the twos, and I won't say what that one is, but yeah, FOMO is definitely that one. Okay, if you're not getting the reference, I'm not going to explain that to you. But yeah, FOMO is how to cope with FOMO and learn to override it, and no Mo FOMO. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about where does it come from. There is a psychological root. And like I said, this podcast and this channel, part of it is to educate you on the psychological and scientific roots of these issues, because if you can understand where it comes from, not only in your experience, but in a cultural sense, you can start to see where you have those experiences, where those came from. You can start to identify those. And if you can give it a name and you can objectify it, then it loses its power. And so that's why understanding it can be so empowering. So what's the psychology behind fear of missing out? There's an actual article with that title, and it's on Slate. And it comes actually from a Quora post. And somebody asked, what's the psychology behind the fear of missing out? And the person that wrote the response was Anita Sands, S-A-N-Z, and she's a clinical psychologist. So she's trained in the field. She's an expert in how the human mind works. And this was her response to what FOMO is, where does it come from? And she says the fear of missing out is actually an ancient fear being triggered by the newest form of communication, social media. So she's looking at it in the context of social media. Once again, I believe you should look at it in a wider context, and I also believe there is a wider context to look at it. But she's focusing on social media, and that is a large part of, I think, why FOMO has been coined a term and why it's a thing, so to speak, in the last few years. Because social media has basically taken what's already in our brains and made it 10 times more prevalent, the fear of missing out. And so she says basically the reason we have FOMO to begin with is our survival as individuals in a tribe, and thus our survival as a species once hinged on being aware of threats to both ourselves and to the larger group. So to be in the know when we roamed around in small groups was critical to survival. And I've talked about in other podcasts, and if not, some people also tend to be highly sensitive, and they're wired that way, and there's about 15 to 30% of the population that's highly sensitive, so they may actually experience more of this FOMO or this fear of missing out because they're the portion of the population that nature made, that God made, and that evolution made to sort of sniff out danger for everybody else. They need people that have the special gift of being able to alert the group. So to not be aware of a new food source, for example, meant you literally missed out on something that could mean the difference between life and death. That's why it's such a strong pull in your body and in your mind. That's why it feels so stressful. When humans began to create more stable farming communities, and being in the know then involved paying attention, being in the right places at the right times to get resources and information, and engaging in gossip of the day as it filtered through the community. And then that evolved once we enhanced our communication. Humans still wanted to keep up and keep informed, whether or not it was a relevant way of being informed. And I'm not saying don't be informed, but I'm just telling you where FOMO comes from. Social media comes in, news, television, newspaper, internet, telephones, social media platforms. And so it says because being left out is considered that important an event for us to pay attention to and to respond to quickly, we actually have a part of our brain that is specialized for sensing if we are being left out or if we're missing out on something. Not that it is usually a matter of life and death anymore, whether you are on Facebook or Twitter, but for many people on social media, it has become their community lifeline. So that's part of it too. And I would argue, now this is just my theory, but I would argue too that if you experienced childhood trauma, if you experienced a lot of invalidation, rejection, if you were in a situation where you were not part of the group, you weren't popular, didn't have a lot of friends, you were rejected, you weren't invited to parties, and a lot of that, kids that experience childhood trauma are more likely to be in that situation. If you were bullied, then I would argue that that's also a place where your natural FOMO and that part of your brain that does that actually got triggered and sensitized even more because it got reinforced when you felt not good enough, when you felt like there was something wrong with you, when you were rejected, when you weren't part of the group, when you weren't popular, when you weren't chosen. And we've all experienced things like that. That's not something that's unique. But for those of us who have experienced invalidation and then we don't believe we're worth anything because other people didn't see us and didn't validate us, or they even went so far as to say hurtful and mean things on a regular basis, and then we believe that about ourselves, and then somehow that gets reflected back to us in our childhood experiences, even though it's not your fault and it's not our fault, that creates even more fear of missing out because you're feeling isolated. And because you didn't get that part of your social development from your childhood, your home, your family, and your friends, you're going to have even more of that because you're going to have that need for that to be fulfilled, that instinct. It's a feedback loop. It becomes this feedback loop where that becomes even more sensitized. So she says that specialized part of the brain is the part of the limbic system, the amygdala, whose job it is to detect whether something could be a threat to our survival. And in other posts, we've talked about how trauma impacts the brain. If you have any kind of trauma, either by omission of something or by some kind of extreme stressor or a tragic event, then those parts of your brain get triggered. And if it happens at a key time and you don't heal that, then you get this feedback loop. As you know, that fight or flight survival gets overstimulated and it turns on even more. So those are the same parts of the brain. And so if that gets activated more, then that FOMO is just going to be a lot worse for somebody than somebody whose brain developed in a healthier way, where that stuff didn't get turned on in an unnatural way. Now, those systems are there for our protection. And they still have relevance even in our culture now. But for the people, like I said, who didn't have that healthy environment growing up, or they got triggered with that fight or flight where they're always sensitive to everything and they react and they're always on high alert and they're always stressed and their cortisol is always going, that FOMO is going to be a lot worse. And so she says feeling physiologically stressed does not feel good, and that is one of the reasons why feeling left out or fear of missing out feels bad and people want to avoid it. So in an attempt to prevent that stress response, some people will unfortunately redouble their efforts to not miss out on anything and end up in almost a constant process of checking behavior. And part of that is why some people become addicted to social media like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or checking their phones, checking the news. I know people that check the news 10 times a day. And it's not healthy to do it that many times. And it's not healthy to check Facebook 20 times a day, but people do it, and that's one reason they may do it. It's not the only reason, but one reason. So, some of the things that you can do to help prevent that include taking breaks from social media. They actually have apps that you can put on your phone, your computer, your desktop, your laptop, and your tablet that will lock you out of Facebook or Instagram or Twitter for 24 hours, 12 hours, 6 hours, 2 days, a week, or whatever. And once you turn that app on, you're locked out. And that could be a good thing if you need to take a social media fast. And I think just like fasting from food or from any other indulgence, fasting from social media is, most people, when they get done, they feel so much better. And that FOMO goes down and it calms down. So, basically, she also says, and this reiterates what I thought when I started thinking about FOMO and then I started thinking about social media. I thought, based on my own experience, I would think people that have survived trauma and people who have experienced anxiety and depression and things like that, wouldn't their FOMO be a lot more active and crazy in sense of that it just keeps feeding through over and over? Wouldn't it be more obsessive? And she says this, in terms of which people may be at most risk for fear of missing out, my best guess would be individuals whose amygdalas, that's the part of the brain that does the fight or flight thing, are already highly sensitive to perceiving threats in the environment. This could include people who tend to be anxious and socially anxious, and those who have experienced some kind of emotional trauma in the past and or tend to be obsessive or compulsive or have an actual diagnosis of OCD. So that's some of the explanation of FOMO and how social media impacts it. And so basically that's a good explanation as to the origins of it and why some people experience it more than others. It sucks. It's not fair. That sucks that you've got all these things to deal with on top of having other psychological issues. But the good news is that just like anything, with work, with focus, with education, and with support, it can be healed. And God can help you to manage it and cope with it and even use it in some cases. I totally believe that. So let's go ahead and move on to a little bit about how God can use FOMO to get us to take action and make the right choices. And also my experience with FOMO, just to give you an example, not to talk about myself, but I can only relate to you my experiences accurately. So I'm using my own experience. So growing up, I experienced some social rejection. There was a lot of times I wasn't invited to parties. I wasn't popular. I didn't have a lot of close friends. I had a couple of very close friends. And so I had this FOMO in terms of just connecting with people and experiencing things. And, I went places when I was a kid. We went to Disney World. We went to Mexico. And so it's not like I didn't experience things. You might even argue that I experienced more things than most people. And I credit my parents for that. They taught us things. They valued education. They took us places. We traveled. But that whole social construct and the whole trauma thing can still do things to your brain that no matter how much you've experienced it, it's not enough. It feels like there's this empty hole inside of you. And so let me just give you an example. Somebody close to me, I went to dinner with them the other day, my husband and I, and they were talking about putting their tree up a little early, right? Well, I'm not a person, this is just my opinion, everybody's entitled to their own, but I'm one of those people that's like, get out of the way, Santa, the turkey's gonna have a few weeks of his own, give him some space. And so I don't like putting up Christmas decorations early. It's just my thing. And so they're talking about putting up their tree 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. And I start feeling like, oh my gosh, I need to put up my tree too. And I wouldn't have even thought that if that other person hadn't said they were going to put up their tree. And when I was growing up, the people that I was around that treated me kindly and my friends that I was around as an adult, I felt like for some reason that I needed to be like them. So one of my close friends, she doesn't wear makeup, she wears baggy clothes, and she has long straight hair. And so when I was around her, guess how I dressed? Long hair, baggy clothes, no makeup. It's neither here nor there. There's nothing wrong with that any more than there's anything wrong with dolling up, wearing makeup, and wearing the latest fashions. And I had another set of friends that was just the opposite. They would tease their hair, dye it blonde, wear a lot of makeup, have the latest fashions, looking nice, and wearing bright colors. So when I was around them, guess what? I wore more lipstick, I wore more eye makeup, I wore bright colors and the latest fashions. Because I felt like if I was to be acceptable, I had to be like them. And they never put that pressure on me. These people on both ends were my true friends. and I accepted them for who they were. But the problem was I wasn't accepting myself for who I was. And my tastes were somewhere in between those two styles. And, a lot of it has to do with mood too. But it was like, I need to dress like them. I need to dress like them. It's like somehow if I had the same eye color as silly as it sounds, if I had the same eye color as my close relative or friend who had a good childhood and who was well adjusted, then maybe somehow that would make me okay too. That sounds absolutely absurd, but I'm willing to bet that some of my listeners have experienced that, and those are just things you don't talk about. Or maybe you do. But that's one kind of FOMO that's not talked about that much. And that's absurd. Like, I'm not downing somebody for feeling or thinking that way. It's a totally normal thing when you've experienced that. And somebody tells you there's something wrong with you, and you feel like there's something wrong with me. And so you start trying to fix yourself and think that if you're like somebody else, you're not like them, and you're not like them, that maybe that's because there's something wrong with you because you're not like them. That's a form of fear of missing out. And another type of FOMO that I would argue that's really bad in our culture is the highlight reel. This is from an article in the ADAA, which is the Anxiety and Depression Association of America. And this article is written by Arti Gupta Psych D. So she's also a clinical psychologist with a PhD. And she talks about FOMO, what FOMO is, how it affects people, and she talks about a highlight reel. And the highlight reel is that thing we see on Facebook where we see the peak moments in other people's lives. And I think I've talked about this, the fact that I have a relative who has this curated Facebook page that is absurdly perfect. I mean, it's not just like positive and polished. It looks like she hired a professional to curate it. It's that insanely fake. And like I said, she's probably not fake, but that image that she puts out is anybody that feels even slightly inadequate, if they looked at her post, would feel like their life is complete crap. It's not. Her life is no better than anybody else's. And so the highlight reel this lady's talking about, she basically says that we witness our screens in simply a highlight reel of our friends' lives, like the Facebook reel. Nevertheless, we can begin to doubt ourselves and our priorities. We wonder why our social and personal lives aren't as robust as theirs, and how exactly we can achieve that elusive balance of living a productive, covetable, and vigorous life, all while remaining sane. And so you see pictures of somebody taking their vacation in Aruba, and you see pictures of somebody climbing a mountaintop or somebody skiing in Vail, Colorado, and you start to feel this twinge of jealousy or envy. And I don't think it's just jealousy and envy. You're like, I need to be doing that too. They're living their life fully. I'm not living my life fully. And that's the worst kind of FOMO. And I experience that literally on a daily basis. So I totally understand that. But in the rest of Dr. Gupta's article, it talks about facing your FOMO, admit you have a problem, switch off the chatter, and practice mindfulness. So she gives some concrete tools on how to deal with FOMO. And so let's look at some ways that you can cope with FOMO. So face your FOMO. She says, admit you have a problem. So, for example, if you go through a reel and you see your rich cousin's post and she's skiing in Vail, Colorado, and she's got a model body and two cute little button-nosed kids and a rich husband, and you feel like crap because you're 30 pounds overweight and your last vacation was 3 years ago and you went to Dollywood for a day or something, how can you compare yourself to anybody because you don't know what's going on behind the scenes, first of all? Second of all, it's not that she's better than you or you're worse than her, but you're using your perceptions to filter out the best of her experience with the worst of yours. And then you're putting them up for comparison. And that is so unfair. But that's how the mind does it. And that's how FOMO works. And that's how people who have not been seen and people who haven't been told that they're beautiful and that they're kind and that they're good and that they are worthy and that they are worth something and that they're a treasure. That's how they're going to they're going to take the worst of themselves and compare it to the best of somebody else in terms of their experience. And then, of course, it's going to go off in the amygdala, and you're going to freak out, and you're going to be like, oh my gosh, I'm missing out on things in my life. Even though if you didn't look at that other person's life, you might have been so happy with your trip to Dollywood, and you might even enjoy it more than the skiing trip to Vail, Colorado, where you might have broken your leg. I'm just saying, So admitting you have a problem, basically you just say, okay, I'm experiencing FOMO. This hurts. Ouch. So it's part of the acorn technique where you admit and accept. Don't judge yourself. Just be like, okay, I'm experiencing FOMO. I'm human. That's okay. And then switch off the chatter. And so turn off the darn Facebook. Don't go back and secretly obsess over this girl's website. You can't get over this stuff if you constantly expose yourself to the thing that's triggering it. Shut it the heck off. And then you need to have some self-talk, and you need to remind yourself that, some of this is not your fault, and that you didn't do anything to deserve this, and you're not insufficient, and you're not inadequate. You are fearfully and wonderfully made, and God loves you. And practicing mindfulness is part of how you can do that. And basically, it's a non-judgmental observation or awareness that is focused on the present experience. So living in the current moment, bringing yourself back to now, maybe even going and doing something that allows you to be in the moment more, can help you to come back to earth, to calm down, to slow down that amygdala response. And so you might do it washing the dishes or going for a walk. She says take a mundane daily activity like washing the dishes and try to sense the muscles you use to wash, the scent of the soap, the feeling of the bubbles next to and between your fingers, rather than multitasking and hurrying around. So if this happens, feel in your body what that feels like. Take a deep breath and let the feeling be there. Don't judge yourself, and don't layer. Don't add, oh, well, I feel so bad because I'm experiencing FOMO. There's something wrong with me. If you feel like there's something wrong with you, then just feel that, and don't feel like there's something wrong with you because you are feeling like there's something wrong with you. You see the difference? You don't add that extra layer of crap to it. And then that keeps it manageable. That keeps it simple. And so those are some coping mechanisms that can help. Meditation will help slow that down. It'll help to make you more aware of your thoughts. It'll help that amygdala response, that fight or flight response, to come down and to happen less often. And that practice of observing your mind and of being mindful will actually help you to catch it when it does happen and to not respond, to choose not to react, but just to sit in that for a moment and not judge yourself. So, when is FOMO unhealthy and destructive? I think I've already given some examples of when FOMO is unhealthy and destructive, but can FOMO actually be healthy and good in some cases? I personally think that FOMO is just like any other emotion, including anger, guilt, sadness, or anything else. It's simply an indicator that something is out of alignment or out of balance that we need to work on bringing back into alignment or balance. Something that needs attention. So you can ask it, what is it that you need me to know? What are you trying to tell me? While you're feeling in your body, while you're being non-judgmental, ask yourself that. You might even journal about it or meditate about it. And ask God to help you to come back to a place where you feel content and where you feel centered and where you feel grounded. And so I think FOMO in some cases is very destructive, and sometimes it could be how you choose to respond to it. FOMO, I don't think, is always a bad thing. Like I said, it could be telling you something. But if you're one of those people that has that trauma, like I do, where the fight or flight is just always turned on and you have to constantly get it to come down and turn it off, then every single time that FOMO comes up, you cannot say, well, God's trying to talk to me. I used to think that, and I was cray-cray, okay? There is no way that your conscience is talking to you like that all the time. If you tried to do everything it told you to do, you would be dead. Okay, so there's got to be some balance there in terms of listening to that and shutting that crap off. So I would argue that most of the time you need to shut that crap off. But I think that if something keeps coming up as a pattern over and over again, it's one of two things. Either it's telling you there's something inside of you that needs to be healed, and that FOMO is a symptom of it. Or if you have a continual pattern, sometimes God might be telling you something. For example, if somebody did something to you when you were a child and you've got a lot of anger and a lot of hard feelings, been there, done that, I totally understand. Okay, I get it. This is just an example. And it just keeps coming up in your mind. I need to talk to this person. I need to talk to this person. I need to talk to this person. Now, first you need to see, is this somebody that you can talk to? Because in some cases, that's not a good idea. But if it's somebody that maybe you could talk to, maybe they've changed, maybe they can be reasoned with in some ways, then maybe God is telling you that you need to work on healing and forgiving that person, and maybe even reconciling with them in some cases. I don't think reconciliation is always the answer, but in some cases it may be. Forgiveness is always the answer, but reconciliation is not. The point is, if that keeps coming up over and over and over, and you feel like this FOMO keeps coming up, I need to do this, I need to do this, I need to do this, I haven't done this, I haven't done this, I haven't done this. Pray about it. Journal about it, meditate on it, and figure out if it could be God trying to tell you that you need to do that, and so that you can heal another stage of grief and trauma in your life. Or if you haven't had a vacation in 18 months and you keep seeing pictures of people's tropical vacations and you're like, I want to do that, I want to do that, I want to do that. It could just be regular FOMO, but it could be that you need to take a break, whether it's a staycation or a week cruise to Jamaica. It's, you pray about it and you write it in your journal and you do some meditation on it, and an answer will come to you. Read scriptures and just think about it and reflect on it and give it time for an answer to come naturally. Don't force one. And I think that something will come up into your spirit that will feel right. And if you get confirmation and if you give it some time and that peace and that answer is still there, there's a good chance that is what that FOMO in that case is a message saying, you need to take some action on this. Because I don't believe FOMO is always a bad thing. How many people do you know that see somebody who's on their deathbed and they see some bitter regret they have, and that puts FOMO in the fear of God in them, and they make radical changes to their life, and then 3 years later they're not even the same person, and they're living a life that they only dreamed of before. So FOMO can actually be a good motivator to forgive people, to live life fully, to enjoy life, to experience things, and to do things. But I think that our society has gotten so caught up in needing to know things, in needing to be in people's business, in needing to experience everything. We live in a generation where people prefer experiences to things, and I think that's great. I would even argue that that's more of a Christian approach to life, that pursuing money and objects is. But I think experiences can also become something that is like a lust or a greed. And when it gets to the point that it controls you and that it's negative and that it's overwhelming you and that it's making you miserable, that's when I think it's like a sin, kind of like being obsessed with power or money or greed or something like that. It becomes an addiction. And that's where we need to stop the cycle and surrender it to God and ask God to help heal us. But then there are, like I said, when you've got some FOMO and it's continuously the same thing over and over, and it doesn't feel like just this, it feels more like guilt compared to shame. Like, shame is basically, there's something wrong with me. Guilt is, I need to correct that. It's not you, it's an action that you choose. And so with FOMO, I think it's the same way. If FOMO is like, there's something wrong with me, there's something wrong with me, if that's what it's coming from, then it's not something you need to do necessarily, but it's something you need to work on inside of yourself. But if it's more like you feel this sort of prodding, but it feels sort of pure and clean, almost like God telling you something, and you don't feel like there's something wrong with me, but it's more like, I need to do this thing, I need to do this thing. then it might be God telling you that there's something you need to work on, or somewhere you need to go, or somebody you need to talk to, or make things right with, or maybe even experience. So those are just some insights that I have. I'm not an expert, and I know that some of this is not documented, but these are things that I've observed from my own experience, from other people's experience, from watching cultural patterns and trends, and there does seem to be a lot of logic to back that up. And so coping with FOMO, I think you need to work on shutting off and getting away from the things that trigger it. When it does come up, observe and be mindful, and don't judge yourself or layer. And you need to pray about it, work through it, meditate on it, and write it in your journal to help get that stuff out and clear it out. And you need to also be able to discern between productive FOMO and destructive FOMO. And sometimes, like I said, there may be some overlap. Some of it may be something that needs to be healed, while some of it may be an actual literal message of something you need to do. Okay, so that's a little bit more on how you can deal with no Mo FOMO. And the FOMO I'm talking about, reverse the letters, and it's not healthy. Okay, so no Mo FOMO in this case, I'm talking about the unhealthy kind. You can live a healthy life, but it does take some work. And I believe that people can heal, and I believe that people can calm that FOMO down, and they can learn to be content. The Bible has verses all over the place about being content. And FOMO is just the opposite of that. And Paul said in one scripture, I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. And he's talking about material provision, but I believe you could also logically add to emotional needs and to experiences, add those to that list. But he says, I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned a secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well fed, in other words, whether I have a rich experience, or whether hungry, and that's whether I'm maybe sitting on the couch every day. I can do everything through Him who gives me strength. And that basically means that when you get that way, go to God, give it to God, surrender it to Him, know that He loves you, know that He's your best friend, know that He will help you with that, and do the work. Do the work. And you will find contentment and healing on the other side of that. I really hope this podcast has helped you, and I hope that it's blessed you. God bless you. And if you would like to sign up for my YouTube channel, it's called Stop Striving and Start Thriving. And I also have, like I said, the podcast is called Christian Emotional Recovery. And I also have a Facebook group called Christian Emotional Recovery Trauma Survivors Unite. And I have a YouTube channel, a Facebook group, and a podcast. And I also have a website called rachelleroy.com, but that's related to my writing students. So if you enjoy writing books and you need guidance and help and tools on that, go over to rachelleroy.com and it'll provide you with a lot of great stuff. rachelleroy.com. Thank you so much for listening to me. I'm so honored to be part of your healing journey. You are fearfully and wonderfully made. You are loved. You are worthy. You are a treasure, and you can heal. God can heal you. God bless you.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode of Christian Emotional Recovery, hosted by Rachel Leroy. For links to this week's resources and to join the discussion, check out this episode's show notes at christianemotionalrecovery.com, where you can also find links to our YouTube channel and Facebook group. Join our email list and get other episodes and resources. If you enjoyed the podcast, please rate and review the podcast and tell a friend who may benefit from this message. See you next time. And remember, beloveds, God loves you, and you are fearfully and wonderfully made.